Arcade Heroes.
With the recent revelation of Raw Thrills as NBA superstars to the market, a strong amount of interest has descended upon arcades again, primarily on social media. As myself and some others have observed, however, many are using the comment sections to lament about the game's arcade exclusive status, demanding that the game come to consoles as quickly as is possible. Some question why Raw Thrills is supposedly leaving so much money on the table. This makes it as good a time as any to talk about arcade to console ports and why such a demand is something of a double-edged sword that requires a more nuanced answer than can be provided in a reply comment. To begin, we need to establish the players, as if you ask the question, are ports a good thing, the answer might depend on who is answering. As such, you have three categories when it comes to the arcade business. You have the player, you have the arcade equipment operator, and then you have the arcade game developer and/or manufacturer. There are also distributors who play a big role in the arcade business, but we won't include them in this discussion other than to say they are in between the developer and the operator, as usual. Now, the answer you'll get will vary between the three, but so will the time we're talking about. If we're talking about an operator in the early 80s versus an operator now, it's going to be a different answer. And so I see this from both of those angles of the gamer and the operator, and we'll try and present each side as fairly as possible. Before we get into those perspectives, though, a little history. Since the first game consoles hit the scene in the late 70s, arcades have always had something of a strange relationship with them, sometimes symbiotic, others parasitic. While it wasn't the first game console in history, the Atari 2600 was the first to be wildly successful, selling over 30 million units over its initial 15-year lifespan. The first pack-in it had was called Combat, which was a port of two of Atari's 70s coin-op games called Tank and Jet Fighter. While the console sold okay, it didn't really blow up until Warner's Manny Gerard saw people at Atari going crazy over a Space Invaders cabinet that they had brought into Atari HQ for research purposes. He instantly went upstairs and made then Atari CEO Ray Kassar get the license for Space Invaders to put onto the Atari 2600. While that was quite a challenge to get the game working on the system, coder Rick Maurer did so, and produced a game that in some ways was better than the arcade version, thanks to the many game variations, full-color graphics, and the ability to play two players simultaneously. Space Invaders thus became the first killer app for consoles, not only selling to those who already owned an Atari 2600, but making people go out and buy the system too. They could finally get what they had been one of the hottest games on the market in their house, which gives us the answer, in part, to why players want ports, getting an arcade experience at home, although I won't say the arcade experience, since even when you play such a game on your couch, it's not the same as playing out in public. That especially holds true if the cabinet does something you couldn't easily or traditionally get at home, like multiple screens and the like. After the Space Invaders port, arcade ports to console became a top priority, thus changing the entire focus of how game consoles in the early 80s would be marketed. But this in turn planted the seeds of the industry's downfall. Atari hyped up the whole Pac-Man day in the spring of '82 for the release of the Pac-Man port to the 2600, but the port was terrible and it damaged Atari's reputation, helping to cause the company to stumble before E.T. was even in theaters yet. I have a whole chapter in my upcoming book dedicated to the game crash and the various factors which caused it, and I don't pin all of it on any one thing, but it is clear to me from my research that ports at the time did play a pretty significant role in that first crash, and even the second arcade crash, which would happen at the turn of the millennium. As for why ports became so prevalent and expected, when everyone saw how much money Atari had made from Space Invaders, they wanted in on the action. Coleco and Parker Brothers became principal porters of the early days, with Coleco infamously making the Donkey Kong port on the 2600, which was subpar at best. Coleco then had an extremely good and almost arcade-perfect port for their ColecoVision console that they launched in 1982. Atari themselves would launch the Atari 5200 Super System later that same year, where its codename was PAM, which stood for Personal Arcade Machine. And out of the 70 games released during that console's lifetime, 36 of them were arcade ports, or 51% of the library. Without spending time on every console, if you launched a console in the 80s and the 90s, then chances are that it had a lot of arcade ports for it. Whether that's the NES, the Master System, the Genesis, SNES, PlayStation, Saturn, Dreamcast, it became an expectation from the consumer that their console would have ports of all the hottest games that were currently at the arcade. So I've already delved into this a bit, so we won't spend a whole lot of time here, but it is self-evident why the consumer wants ports. Growing up in the 80s, long before I was an arcade operator, I was a gamer and I played a lot of great games. Asteroids, Pac-Man, Space Invaders, Frontline, Donkey Kong, Battlezone, Centipede, Contra, Star Trek, Strategic Operations Simulator, and so on. And as a child, I had absolutely no idea that any of those were arcade games when I first played them. I didn't even know what an arcade was until the late 80s, as I was in the middle of suburbia and there was no arcade within walking distance of me, except for a 7-Eleven, which only had a couple of games, although I don't recall noticing them until I was older, and so it didn't really matter to me anyways. Even with my first visit to an arcade, I didn't come across any of the games that I had played on consoles like the 2600 or the Atari 800 XL or the NES at a friend's house. I was just oblivious to it. Now, even today, I have arcade ports on every console that I own, whether that was all 3 Midway arcade treasures for the original Xbox, or the Atari 50th Anniversary Collection and Samurai Showdown Collection on Switch, to arcade collections on Steam. But you might have noticed that most of those ports, or at least those that happen these days, came from games that were released 30 or 40 years ago, and rarely come from games released today. Why is that? Well, we'll have to look at operators for the answer. But from our player perspective, the answers are we want ports because we're getting something of the arcade experience at home, although it's not going to be, one-to-one the same. It allows you to enjoy a game when you might not have any arcade within an easy accessible distance. And I didn't mention that there's also the concept of preservation's sake. That's just not truly relevant to what we're talking about here. In becoming an arcade operator, it opened my eyes as to why ports do have some downsides, and I'm not talking about buggy or imperfect ports. Why would they, as this cover from Playmeter magazine in December 1982 shows, be considered a hidden threat? It's essential to understand that without the arcade operator, you don't have an arcade industry. Even in Japan, where many game devs have operated chains of locations, you still have operators either running those locations individually or operating games independently. Operators come in two flavors: someone like me who owns and operates games at his location, or the route, or also called street operator, who buys games then puts them into someone else's business, whether that's theater lobbies, restaurants, rest stops, gas stations, bowling alleys, and so on. The arcade industry is only dead when there are no more operators left. Unfortunately, there's no hard data on how many operators exist out there at present, other than knowing that it's in the thousands. There's a giant trade show called IAAPA, which is held in Orlando each year, and that usually draws somewhere around 37 to 40,000 industry professionals, and a large chunk of those are operators looking for equipment to buy for their locations. In case anyone out there was perplexed by an announcement like NBA Superstars, as I have seen in some comments across the internet, where they're utterly baffled by the existence of the game and asking, who's this for since arcades are dead? Well, it's for the operator who is still around. So how the arcade business works is that you develop a game, and then you have to convince the operator to buy it. If they do so, they'll put it on location and perhaps buy more. But how do you convince them? Usually by making a game that's affordable and will earn well and earn enough to pay for itself off in a reasonable amount of time, say a year or less, and then make a healthy profit afterwards. A game that doesn't earn doesn't get bought. This is where ports have caused something of a love-hate relationship with operators. Now, if we turn the clock back to 1982, here's a letter from an operator by the name of Jack Guarineri. You might have heard of a modern company called Jersey Jack Pinball. Well, it's the same guy. And he had a bone to pick with ports at the time. After paying $3,400 for my new Turbo and $2,650 for my Donkey Kong, I'm standing in one of my locations reading a game magazine on the shelf, offering not only Turbo and Donkey Kong on home video game versions, but Zaxxon, Venture, Spectre, Phoenix, and a game that's just been released, Tron, not to mention scores more. What's going on? Can't these manufacturers wait till I finish paying for these games at least before they release them for home versions? I'd like to know how the operators of 1982 are coping with increased game prices, as well as higher equipment output from major manufacturers, as well as the smaller manufacturers. And don't forget the bootleggers, along with high interest rates, location bonuses, more competition from other operators, and generally lower collections. Many operators blame the industry problem on the manufacturers, and home games are just a part of it. The trade-in market on good used equipment no longer exists as we knew it. Games are almost worthless after a year, that's if you were lucky. Operators today can't afford to buy anything but what they think will be a hit, and understandably so. Manufacturers, through their higher output of equipment, have taken an open market and have come close to saturation in just 2 years. Where if equipment were released with better timing, the market would be there longer and used equipment would have value. The major manufacturers have an obligation to the future of this industry and not the home market. It was our money that made these manufacturers flourish, and operators should not be sold out for the home market. For just as companies are made, they can be put under. Operators cannot continue to buy equipment for $3,000 each and turn it over in 6 months and stay in business. The manufacturers have done many good things for the advancement of the industry as well. Innovations made make today's game better moneymakers than ever before, but rising costs are higher than rising collections. Everyone must work together as one to make this industry better for operators, manufacturers, and distributors, and the time to do it is now. Because if we don't, a few issues from now, some of you may no longer be in business at all. Jack Borineri, Brooklyn, New York. Little did Jack know, the industry was about to experience some deep pain over the next 2 years, and sadly enough, some but not all of the same issues exist today. Here's some stats of how badly things crashed for the industry in a market saturated with home ports, although I should emphasize those were not all to blame. Buy my upcoming book when I finally finish it for a complete explanation. But check out these statistics. What Jack said was 100% true. In 1982, you had around 12,000 operators. The next year, there was only 11,000. By 1984, there was only 9,000 left, and I believe it got even lower than that shortly afterwards. But it did get better. Things did bounce back after 1986 or so, and then, of course, into the 90s with Street Fighter II and fighting games and then rhythm games and such. But it still was a very painful time then. Now, this whole situation would change when consoles caught up in terms of power and quality with arcade hardware, making ports much more of a threat in the 1990s than I think they were in the early 80s. So, it's time for some personal experience with this that comes to us from today. The fact that operators need games that make money in a reasonable amount of time is still very relevant and a point to keep in mind. And what I want to drive home here is that any damage that a port can do depends a lot on what kind of game it is and when that port happens. So back in January 2011, my distributor called me and asked if I'd be interested in the Super Street Fighter 4 Arcade Edition board that had just become available. Both he and Yoshinori Ono had said at the time that it was supposed to be a special arcade exclusive version of the game. While the price tag for it was a bit insane at $10,000 just for the computer and nothing else, I asked my customers about it and immediately started getting phone calls asking me to go for it. I figured it would be a huge win because I'd never seen any reaction like that before to a game that I said I was thinking about, so I called my distributor back, paid for it, and got it on order. And then I had to wait, and wait, and wait. And March came along without any news on where my order was, and then the great Japanese earthquake that caused Fukushima and all that happened. With that as a backdrop, Ono-san changed his tune and said that they would be releasing Arcade Edition to consoles that summer. I couldn't get a refund on this system as I had paid for it already. It was a special order, and so they just didn't allow for it. But I demanded as much as I could to get the thing as soon as possible, but that was made difficult by the fact that the earthquake disrupted all sorts of things, transportation included. Finally, after too many angry phone calls, the unit arrived in the middle of April of that year. To the game's credit, it was amazing. Once I got it set up in a showcase cabinet, local Street Fighter fans donated some Street Fighter 4 arcade sticks, Sanwa style, that we wired into the game, and they donated a 32-inch IPS TV to ensure the best look possible. Soon, every day that I opened, I had guys waiting for the gate to go up so they could come in and play just that game. Even on my slowest day of the week, say Wednesday, I had 40 to 50 guys standing outside waiting to come in the morning. They would often play other games while they waited for their next match too. And then they organized their own tournaments, which further helped things out. But then my luck ran out and the computer died. I had to send it back to Japan for warranty repair. Now fortunately the turnaround was much faster than the initial wait, only taking about a week and a half. But that still ate into my exclusive time and it helped kill the momentum which I had built with local Street Fighter fans. The day before the game hit consoles, we were busy with Street Fighter 4 players, although not as many as when I'd received the game, and then the day it came out, 98% of them disappeared. I had to lower the game's cost from 75 cents a play to 25 cents to entice anybody to even give it a try, but it would still lose out some weeks on earnings to my old Street Fighter 2 game. Then my luck really ran out again after a few months when the hardware crapped out again and it was out of warranty at this point, and seeing it would cost too much to fix, I just never ended up getting it repaired. All in all, it was a huge loss. I only made somewhere around $2,000 from my $10,000 investment. Now, if you borrow my operator's shoes for a second and put yourself in a position like mine, ask yourself, how often could I afford to lose $8,000 or more, all because of some corporate greed and impatience? Sure, for the time that I had Street Fighter 4 and it was working, a mere, say, month and a half, I'd never seen anything like it. Ultimately, though, that just didn't matter because I took a huge loss on it. It was only because of exclusive arcade games like Raw Thrills' Jurassic Park that I was able to stay afloat and live to see another day. But it did poison the well for me in terms of exclusives versus ports to some degree, and I know I'm not alone on this. When I've talked with other operator colleagues in the business who have been around here longer than I have, they'll point out things like Soul Calibur 3, which was released, or the arcade version and the home versions were released very close to each other. I believe the same thing happened with some versions of Tekken. And of course, recently people have been asking, well, where's Tekken 8 in arcades? Well, you're not really going to find any arcade operators out there, unless they've just got more money than they know what to do with, that would want to invest into an arcade game after it's already out on consoles anyways. From everything that I've been hearing, Street Fighter 6 Arcade Edition over in Japan has been a flop, where people just aren't playing it very much, and there are other fighting games that are older that are making more money than Street Fighter 6 is. Now, to be fair, this is where what kind of game it is matters to this whole subject. I also own a Cruis'n Blast and Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles by Raw Thrills. Both games have been somewhat recently ported to consoles. TMNT was just last month in April of 2024. Did the same thing happen with them that happened with Street Fighter 4? Well, no, it did not. Now, it's hard to compare apples to apples here because the customer reaction to all three games was very different. Street Fighter 4 had crowds and people buying stuff to help me with it. Neither Cruis'n nor TMNT had that. Cruis'n was my #1 game most weeks, but after the port, it dropped slightly to something like 3rd or 4th place most weeks. But it didn't base jump off of a cliff without a parachute like Street Fighter 4 did. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles never did super well, but it did fine enough. It just never had people waiting in line to play it. So far, it's still a little early to judge, but it's dipping just slightly, but it also hasn't been in my top 10 earners for a long time either. So what's my takeaway from all this? Don't invest a lot of money into fighting games. As long as the devs can be patient enough to wait several years before they release a port, giving operators time to pay their machines off and make a profit, then I don't really have a reason to complain. Now, as Jack mentioned, there's another issue, and right, it was an issue then, it's an issue now, particularly lately with inflation and such, and that's really high game prices. So right now, the cost on brand new arcade games is nothing short of what I would call crazy. When I started 16 years ago, the average cost of a new game was about $7,000. Right now in 2024, it's doubled that. And this is all due to economic issues at play, not just inflation, but production problems for parts, shipping delays, rising transportation costs, rising development costs, but also a push in the industry to go for super expensive games like virtual reality based games where they charge $40 to $50, sometimes even higher, $50,000 and sometimes even higher, and it's just been pushing all the averages up. But even then, something like NBA Superstars, it probably would have cost around $8,000, maybe $9,000 had it been released a decade ago, but right now it's $15,000, and that's a lot of plays that it has to make before it even pays itself off. And then, of course, that's costing you, the player, a prettier penny, since many places out there have had to raise their prices to deal with all the other costs they have, which includes wages, rent, insurance, taxes, electrical, and so on. Okay, finally, we are at the developer's angle. Our brief history on Space Invaders being ported to the Atari explains why ports are appealing to the developer. It can make them a lot of money, boosting both the profile of the game in question as well as their brand. But times have changed. One thing that I want to emphasize is that you can't always approach today's gaming culture with an attitude like it's 1982. Or I guess you shouldn't do that at all. To find out about this, though, I wanted to ask somebody who's been there in the trenches, creating explosive game experiences in the arcade and seeing them ported to home consoles. So I asked Eugene Jarvis, current CEO of Raw Thrills, past creator of Williams and Midway hits like Defender, Robotron, Narc, Cruis'n USA, and today, as that CEO of Raw Thrills, the maker of just about every hit that we see in the industry, including NBA Superstars. I asked him what he thought about ports, and this was his response. Quote, "Back in the 80s and early 90s, the positives of a home port was that the marketing campaign publicizing the home game helped drive traffic to the arcade, since the arcade version was a technically and graphically superior experience. Think Mortal Kombat, NBA Jam, and the Cruis'n drivers, which became massive hits in the arcade and the home simultaneously. However, as the hardware capabilities of PC and console games caught up to the arcades in the late 90s, the home ports started cannibalizing the hardcore arcade players. By the early 2000s, networked play and the advent of the Xbox and PS2 caused hardcore gamers to move online and away from the arcades. The loss of this hardcore audience caused an arcade crash, and many locations, manufacturers, and distributors were forced to close." As an editorial note, that would include Midway, which Eugene used to work for. Okay, back to what he was saying. With the exception of Nintendo, console, and PC developers increasingly focused their efforts on this growing hardcore community with complex M-rated games, abandoning more casual markets. The remnants of the arcade industry returned to its roots of family entertainment, aka FEC, or Family Entertainment Centers, and compelling accessible casual play experiences. As console, mobile, and PC developers created longer playing and more complex titles, casual players moved to the arcade, fueling a steady expansion of the arcade industry over the past 2 decades. Because of this divergence of the home and arcade markets, today we see very little competition between arcade and console, PC, mobile. During the pandemic shutdown of the FEC arcade market in 2020, our developers created a port of Cruis'n Blast for the Nintendo Switch. The port was extremely well received by the Nintendo community, prominently featured in their marketing campaigns. When the arcades reopened in 2021, Cruis'n Blast arcade gameplay strongly increased, and Cruis'n Blast has become our greatest selling arcade game in the history of Raw Thrills. We're still making Cruis'n Blast arcade games to this day, so based on our limited experience, home ports seem positive for arcade games today." End quote. So I really appreciate Eugene's astute perspective on this, as he explained for me what led to the lesser-known industry crash at the turn of the millennium. Arcades lost their hardcore player market, and to pivot they became more focused on family entertainment, as he mentioned, FEC, and that would include redemption play. But it's important to note that despite the fact that arcades shifted in that direction, there's still been video games made to appeal to gamers. Sure, for the most part, that has not included the gamer much, but the hardcore gamer is so accustomed to getting a port on everything they want, it becomes meaningless to even make games for them in the first place. Why bother wasting time and money on an arcade machine when you could just take it straight to home? But that does change how games are developed, how they are made, as you want to appeal not only to the audience but to the platform and the strengths of that platform. I mean, look at how some games changed when they were made for console first. Raiden 5 or Street Fighter 5. They became so different because they were trying to appeal to a different audience. That, of course, creates a little conundrum. Real arcade games, and when I say that, I'm not meaning the type of arcade category you would find on Steam or PSN or eShop or any of the console shops, but the ones I've been talking about this whole time. Coin-operated arcades is what we used to call them, but we don't use coins in most instances anymore, so pay-to-play arcade games. They require a very different design philosophy behind them than do console or even mobile games. Arcades are like roller coasters, giving you a ton of action in a short period of time, while console games are either about farming items or playing an interactive movie. Now, I've done a whole video on this, and we'll spare rehashing the entire thing. Suffice to say, if you do a straight port from arcades to consoles these days, most fans aren't going to think it's worth the $30 or $40 you're asking for it. They'd probably demand something like $5, but that's just not reasonable. Eugene's also stated in the past that games like Terminator Salvation and Jurassic Park cost him around $4 million to make, which did not include the manufacturing portion of the game. And when you come to what's happened with inflation and such, it's probably costing him twice as much to do so now. But if you want to entice home buyers to get a game, you have to add more content to make it worth their money. That may include more game modes, but it requires you to pay coders, artists to do that sort of work, and that work doesn't come cheap. So it can get somewhere, if not thousands, possibly hundreds of thousands of dollars to make it all happen. In that instance, you have to be absolutely sure that the game will sell enough copies on console to make that extra cost worth it, much less helping to cover any original arcade development costs. But is this a guaranteed success to print out a ton of money? Well, no, it isn't. For one, there's a lot more games coming out on the various home platforms these days than we've seen throughout most of gaming history. Back in the early 80s, you did not have hundreds of games coming out every month like you have now, and that creates a lot of competition for consumer dollars. And I wanted to get some hard data on this, and I actually reached out to Simon Carlos, who operates a newsletter called Game Discover Co., where he deals all in sales data. Unfortunately, there's very little data available on how well arcade ports do, although he noted that on the PlayStation alone, Konami's somewhat recent Arcade Classics collection had sold 40,000 copies, which is decent. But there's no evidence that he could find, or that I've been able to find, that any arcade port is selling hundreds of thousands of units, let alone millions of copies. And also keep in mind, the developer's not going to get 100% of the sale of the game either, and so there's an inherent risk there to make sure your port sells well enough to cover the costs of your original game development, and then the costs of the new console port development, and not lose you money. As a note to that, every time I've asked someone at Sega about modern ports, they point to two negative cases for them. Outrun 2 on the original Xbox and Jambo Safari for the Wii. Now, the latter game almost bankrupts Sega, although to be fair, it was done at a time before digital was so prevalent. Still, they printed 70,000 copies of the game for the Wii, and only sold a fraction of that back when the game was much more fresh in gamers' minds. It's telling that they also stopped doing Sega Ages ports too, although I can't seem to track down sales numbers on those. Either way, would you think a port is worth it if it ends up bankrupting the developer just because a loud contingent of online gamers claim they want it and then they end up not buying it? Probably not. I'll also throw out one other thing before I finish here. If it's okay for consoles to have certain exclusives to their platforms, then it's okay for arcades to have them as well. These days, devs are keen to make part of the exclusive experience come from the cabinet and controls, not just the software, by adding in little gimmicks. Now yeah, sometimes those gimmicks can be pointless, like LED lighting or something, but they can also be nice and help a game stand out, such as having a dome screen, or having an 8-player joystick game where you're all standing around a giant screen to play Pac-Man. Either way, don't write off the real arcade experience. It's on a different level than home gaming, and it can still be a lot of fun, even if it has nothing to do with earning tickets for prizes. So to finish this, here are the salient points. Historically, ports did damage the industry. Ports can be great these days as long as operators are given plenty of time to make a profit off of the original game. Ports are not a guaranteed money printer for the developer. So I hope you enjoyed this discussion about ports, but of course there may be other points that I missed. I actually ended up writing a lot more for this than I used here, and so I know there's more ways to go about discussing this, so please feel free to do so below. Just keep in mind when you're begging for a port that you're not asking to hurt other people's businesses. That's what you're basically doing when it comes to operators themselves. So even though Eugene had said that Cruis'n Blast was still performing really well for them and is one of their best sellers ever, I know for certain from another statement at somebody at Raw Thrills that Cruis'n Blast has sold over 10,000 units for them. Not on the Switch, but as arcade units. That's extremely good. But does that mean that they should have released the Cruis'n Blast Switch port right after the arcade port? No, I think it still should have given a few years at least, if not several years worth of time, to just help make sure that we still have nothing else that we're competing with. Because that's another thing too, operators are competing with each other. And so where I'm at in my arcade, I'm right down the hall from a major family entertainment center and who has millions of dollars to throw at games, and they buy a lot of Raw Thrills games, and that makes it difficult for me to invest in Raw Thrills now, even though Raw Thrills games are the ones that still make a lot of money. But either way, let me know what your thoughts are on this below, and perhaps if there's more to discuss, I'll do another video. But thank you for watching, and we'll see you at the arcade.